into the official introduction, so to speak. I'd like to thank a few people who have really put the original exhibition together. I'd like to start with Mark Baines, who was really the original organizer, and for reformatting the exhibition to work with our space here at the AA, as well as all the students at the Macintosh School who made such fantastic models, as well as others at the Glasgow School of Art. Gavin Stamp, who came to us with the idea in the first place, the Glasgow Development Agency, as well as all the sponsors, and I think a lot of them are here in the audience and they know who they are, who provided financial support for the exhibition. From DAA, I'd also like to thank Linda Brown, Andrew McKenzie, and their team for putting the whole thing together. I'm very grateful that Gordon Benson has agreed to do the introduction. I think he's one of the most knowledgeable people on the work of the practice and in terms of being able to situate it within a larger context. Would you please join me in welcoming Gordon Benson?
Thank you very much indeed. Can you all hear me? Yeah? You nod, yeah? I do that because there's in Colin Rowe's biography, he describes this wonderful lecture he went to by Maneo, which he sat through, which was, as he understood it, entitled Sickness and Death, which seemed entirely appropriate. And at the end of it, it turned out to be Sickness and Depth. And that we will be speaking about thickness and depth. This kind of issue of looking back at the past, I suppose, begins in the Renaissance, and there was a very particular sort of program at that time, as you all know. And the sort of distance between where they were and what they were looking at was relatively large. And since then, we've increased we've diminished the distance, in a sense, between where we are and what we look back at. And to a fault in some instances, in my view at any rate. But I don't think that applies tonight. And I'm very glad that Metzstein asked me to put it into some sort of context. I don't know about being the best equipped person, but it certainly have like I'm sure a lot of you here, a very sort of personal sort of involvement with Izzy and Andy and the practice. And I'd like to say something perhaps about that rather, and through that, about the more general aspects of the work. I mean, as most of you will know, there is an older tradition of the practice of Gillespie Kidd and Coia, which goes back to Gillespie, who's an associate of Mackintosh and so on. And then Coia's own work, which is effectively up until the war. And that really, in 1945, Izzy joined the practice at the age of, I think, 17, and worked there until the age of, 20, whatever it was, 1954, 1926 or something, when Andy joined. And really there is a kind of a datum which occurs about 1955-ish, and it's sort of registered, I suppose, with the first building in the exhibition that you see, which is the Glenrothes Church. But I mentioned that earlier tradition because it's not unimportant that Izzy, obviously from the age of 16, and Andy elsewhere, Izzy in Coia's, had been working on sort of essentially ecclesiastical buildings and really learning about building and making buildings and how to build buildings, really sort of hot out of the kind of Victorian tradition. And that really is one sort of string to the bow, which carries through really to the last of the pieces of work, is this, how to make buildings and the materiality of them, as well as the other stuff which we recognize, which is the kind of conceptual foundation. And I think most of all, really the principles. And in a sense, they were, in meeting them, not only did they, as you all know, build buildings, but they endlessly spoke about buildings. And in fact, the speaking and talking about buildings became continuous with the buildings themselves. And they spoke about them in a way which really is the establishing, and through a set of principles, and through those principles to sort of elevate, in a sense, the autonomy of architecture, but also to reconnect that autonomous architecture back to those other factors which, together with architecture, constitute life. And I think it was that sort of sense of the continuity of architecture and life, which is really one of the things that I feel most strongly about their work and their lives, in fact. My sort of early experiences with them were that as a student, most of the buildings that you were seeing were actually being built. And so every weekend, one could go out and see these things under construction. And that was a remarkable piece of education to parallel this more abstracted sort of fumbling intellectual activities that we got involved in Glasgow at that time, and genuinely stimulating. And to stumble across them, to actually, I was driving past Glasgow Green at the age of sort of 19 or something, and suddenly there is this building, which is recognizably unlike any other building I had seen, which is the little school there. Indeed, it's one of their only, it's in the exhibition again, it's one of the few buildings that is built in the city. And one of the great ironies about their work is that, given their background, Andy locked since Mother's Milk into Glasgow, and Izzy with Berlin and then Glasgow, that their love of cities, their interest, their preoccupation with cities, that relatively few of the buildings are actually in the cities. And in a sense, if one wants to get some kind of idea about that, it's through things that they have written and the work of the students rather than the work itself. Although there are obviously analogues that one can get at. It was also interesting because it was a curious period, and it was a period which most of the people, I guess, in the room looking at the sort of age spectrum will be familiar with, but is really quite distinct, in a sense, in several ways from the present. There were a number of firms who were working in parallel. There was clearly Powell and Moya, Lyons, Israel Nellis, St. John Wilson, Leslie Martin, etc. And one felt that problems were being addressed sort of simultaneously, and one could actually evaluate the sort of little pieces of progress and sort of development and better plans and better solutions and actually better buildings that you could actually measure one against the other, which is immensely difficult today. It's really quite difficult to think of the last really good plan that you saw. And it's in that sense that it is, I think the exhibition is not history and must not be seen as history, except a sort of a particularly positive view of what one might do with history. But really, I think that for students and for people, that if one can reconnect this generation of students back with this work, there is an immense amount to be learnt from it. And it is not all, in a sense, lost. And I'll maybe come back to that at the end. I mean, it is visible in its original state in fragments and in pieces and in certain kinds of ways. Because I think that there are dimensions of the work that really are not actually available to students in many other forms. In terms of these overlapping and interlayering of work that went on at that time between a number of practices, there was obviously the kind of alto and corb, and it's interesting that Harvey Court should have been called a sort of shotgun marriage between alto and corb. First time I met Stirling, I asked him what he thought about Andy and Izzy, and he said, "Oh, they're that funny mixture of alto and corb, aren't they?" And there's some of that in it. There's also the thing which is obvious to those of you who know Glasgow and have read their work, that is they're inextricably bound up with that city and certain aspects of its buildings. But the nature of the building, and many, many other things, and really it's like the complexity of life has been re-synthesized through their sensibilities and actually emerges in the architecture itself. And so it's wrong to kind of cherry pick these pieces or ideas or notions or whatever. And because in a way, I think that the sort of corb that they came in on, I mean, the great joke in the office was they reckoned that Corb's next building was going to be a Scottish tower house. And he got pretty close at Fermany. and because in a sense the issue that they had engaged, I mean, if the modern movement did anything, it demolished the wall, and the wall is both load-bearing and thickened container, etc. But then Corb, having got rid of it, pretended he'd reinvented it, and there it appeared again. But of course they'd had it all the time. There were also in that period, because of the range of work, there were sort of chains of conceptual thought that sort of ran through the work. And you could actually, and you can trace from the churches sort of an evolutionary line from Glenrothes, who in fact what is effectively, and its brother, which is an extruded building where the light, the windows are visible, where the windows are rotated on the diagonal, so rather than being an extrusion, it becomes a finite object, where the catenary of the trusses is allowed to happen rather than resisted, and the things have a kind of an inevitable set of stepping stones, which is not available unless you do that number of buildings in that amount of time. And it is an astonishing number of buildings in effectively 20 years, because it's sort of 55 to 75. And there were approximately 12 people in that practice. I mean, it is absolutely breathtaking. And these are fully drawn and fully detailed, impeccably worked out buildings. There's a second kind of pattern of churches which are also interesting, which are to do with the wall, where the windows are not seen. In a sense, there's an obvious ancestry to that. You approach Ronchamp, no windows in the south facade. You get inside and that wall sort of evaporates into light. And an equivalent, but really for a more northern thing, is the church, which is illustrated on the invitation to this evening, which is the church at East Kilbride, which is genuinely miraculous, because there are no windows, there are the cannons on the roof, you walk in and bang, and the light hits the chimneys and the light is dynamic. There's another extraordinary moment where in fact there is another, I won't go on because I'm sure it's going to come up, but there is another of these chains that run through the school, basically from recognizably buildings which are recognizable to some of the work of Lyons, Israel, Smithson, etc., and campus planning effectively. And there's a sort of line that takes that through until you get a building where the cellular stuff is actually used to enclose the larger volumes. And that then coalesces or passes through some of the church thinking, and you actually get to, curiously, it seems obvious retrospectively, to Cardross. And there are moments in Cardross where you actually look at, and there's a remarkable photograph which I refer you all to in the Mac mag, which was written, of looking towards, because this is not a recoverable experience except in one way. It's probably the most cinematic moment in any of their buildings, where you look at the back curved wall, which is luminous behind the altar, and the procession of priests would arise with their staffs and crosses up against this wall. But as you look at it and look up, there is you can actually, through a second window, see a zigguratted roof light, which is providing the light that provides the, as it were, the luminous nature of the wall itself. And so it's like a kind of both the text and subtext are made available to you if you're interested in these things. If you're not interested in these things, it's just a miraculously uplifting and spiritual sort of moment. That is not available because that is gone and lost. I'd like to just say where do we go and how do we end it, because I'd like to get on and let really Izzy speak. That it seems to me there are a few things. There's a lot to be learnt from the work. The work must be obviously made more available than it is at present. Most of the drawings, which in themselves are just sublime things and are almost a lost art that people don't and cannot afford, probably, we do, foolishly, to draw buildings like that. But it certainly is not going to persist. And the drawings must actually have an appropriate home. It seems to me that the vandalism which has taken place to the East Kilbride Church must be restored. They must rebuild the campanile, and there must be a lottery application to ensure that that gets rebuilt, and these ridiculous downpipes get taken out of the facade of the building, and the thing is reinstated in a way that is appropriate for a building of that presence and dignity. But it's not all gloom, because I think if you go to the Denniston Church, certainly internally, you get a feeling in that church that for some reason it has... there are many others, and there are many other buildings, but I'm thinking specific of the buildings in Glasgow, because obviously the Cambridge is there and it's intact and impeccable, but of the buildings, as it were, in their own sort of location of their genesis, the Denniston Church interior, I think, is pretty well perfect. I mean, it's actually as it was. And again, there's another game of luminosity, of sort of curious finials, of transparent screens, of layers, of devices, all of which have become part of a certain kind of rhetoric. Finally, I think that Cardross itself, and Izzy obviously will not comment on any of these things, but my own view is that the flesh and what's left of the flesh should now be, i.e. those bits which can degrade, should be removed from the building. And it should be stripped back to its skeletal form. And that any attempt, of which there have been many, to turn it into some vulgar hotel or all these nonsensical propositions, must be totally resisted. And the thing must remain as an archaeological or historical site, much the way the Lithgow Palace remains in that nature. And that if a poetic and sensitive proposition were to be proposed, which used that in itself as a site, that I think could be considered and might be welcome. And I think there is a second or further poetic intervention that could be made. I'd like finally to say that as those of you who know them will be fully aware, neither Andy nor Izzy solicited this exhibition, and they had to be almost dragged into it. But I am, certainly for one, and as I'm sure you are, absolutely delighted that they were dragged into it. Izzy, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot of other people have to be thanked. I'm not sure whether I should do it at the beginning or the end. One person I'm afraid he may not be thanked is Andy MacMillan, who this is the second time he's let me down, I must admit. I'm not sure whether I should apologize for him. In a previous occasion, I had a good reason to say, you're only getting half the lecture because it's only half the lecture room is full. In this case, you're getting the whole lecture, I hope, with a very full lecture room. I'm very turned on by all this, I must admit. I'm very grateful that people should turn out for this occasion, and frankly, I like to see all these familiar faces. I thought the place might be full of familiar faces. I'm gratified that even more familiar faces have turned up, especially among the younger architectural cohort, whom I had the pleasure to, in many cases, teach. And I'm glad you haven't quite forgotten me. Incidentally, on a previous occasion when I had to do this sort of thing, not quite working for on the work of Gillespie Kidd and Coia, but on the speaking to a large number of people, people said such nice things about me. I had to say, why didn't they say these nice things about me when I was still alive? Well, Gordon, I'm very grateful. I'm extremely grateful. But in any case, also have to do, I think I'll give some of the thanks at the beginning. First of all, I naturally have to add my thanks to all the people that have been mentioned as being more responsible for this exhibition than I am. Secondly, I must also personally thank the students who I think made a brilliant job of the models. And the only thing that allowed me to be dragged into this arena in the first place, because I thought they deserved all the credit and maybe the support that they earned. So I must say right now, the drawings, and particularly the models, I must say, well, apart from being personally flattering, they are so beautiful that even I enjoy looking at them. Secondly, I would also dedicate, I think, this lecture to somebody who is very important to the production of this work. Of course, all our staff over many years, and who've all made important contributions, but they can't all be mentioned by names. But unfortunately, the one person who I think deserves and needs and must be kept alive in a manner of speaking is a youngish man who died rather younger than he should have, or anybody should have, and that's John Cowell. Most of the drawings that are exhibited not the new drawings, but the existing drawings. And most of the development and the collaboration and the elaboration of the work, as you see it now, was certainly, to a large extent, his effort. Now I suppose it's time to start talking about the buildings. Now I suppose I'll have to briefly discuss the historical background, which Gordon touched on, but I think it's very important. The firm of Gillespie Kidd and Coia has a long history and has gone through a whole series of manifestations. But the work that is being shown now is entirely the work from about 56 to 86 or something like that, whatever you care to mention. And it involves a new situation, a new historical situation, which some of you, of course, will remember clearly. For instance, Gordon has rightly alluded to the fact that very few of the buildings have got an urban context. Well, when we started working, we were, I was to say victims of the welfare state. No, we were beneficiaries of the welfare state as architects. I've never benefited from the welfare state personally, because every time I get to the point, they change the rules. But as far as the benefit to architecture, it's certainly very important. We lived at a time, at least we worked at a time, when everything was going to be redone, and everything started from scratch, and everything was going to be very beautiful and marvelous, and that most of the buildings we worked on, or in fact almost all of the buildings we worked on, were for public bodies, whether it's governmental or local authority bodies, or the church, or universities, etc. People who were deeply concerned about, not only about architecture, but the future, and who had enough money and maybe not enough time to stop you doing what you wanted to do. They let you do what you wanted to do, and they didn't have too much time to stop you doing it. I think it's the other way around now. Too much time to stop you doing it, and not enough money to encourage you to try in the first place. So almost all these buildings are buildings which are connected in some way with human welfare, and I cannot see a nicer way of spending one's life developing buildings which are hopefully beneficial to people on a practical and physical level, and might have some architectural content, which is the only reward, in fact, that an architect, in my view, gets, or deserves for that matter. So it was a good time, and that time, of course, came to an end. Our own practice, or the period I'm talking about, is parallels, or is synchronized more or less with the emergence of the welfare state, its high point, and its slow disappearance. And one might well say that the form of Gillespie Coia, in this particular period, enjoyed exactly the same graph. Now, I think enough's enough. I will now try to set a background to the exhibition. And indeed, this is essentially a commentary to the exhibition. It's meant to make the exhibition a little more understandable, or perhaps maybe not so much understandable, but to show some consistency. And that consistency, incidentally, can only be achieved in a situation where repeated work opportunities in the same building types, and a limited number of building types are available. And that was one of the peculiarities of that period. You could do a school, you could do another school, and do another school, and every time you could add something to your perception. Both the program change, the site change, but the basic underlying ideas could be reused, redeveloped, or developed further. And that is what I'm trying to discuss in this hopefully in a relatively few words. Now, there are, of course, I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't want to talk about space and light. We all know that architecture is about that sort of thing. And nothing I'm saying now, which concentrates on a number of themes, is in any way ignoring what is the ultimate purpose of the buildings, as we all know, and we share that delight, is the usefulness of the buildings as an internal, operable and operative system. But we're deliberately looking at our own work and looking at other people's work, and may I say, in view of my, admittedly, some people think, reactionary attitude to some of the current tendencies, I've tried to excavate from the archaeology of our architecture some concerns which we were not necessarily conscious of at the time, but at a certain stage in your life, we're going to realize, looking back, that there were a series of concerns, and these concerns form the basis of the exhibition. and the basis of my talk tonight. Now, one of the things that has already been said, and it cannot, I think, be said well, from my point of view, cannot be said too often, is the fact that the office, which I joined in 1945, and actually joined in 1953, had a history of ecclesiastical work. Now, I consider that very important for a number of reasons. One, of course, is, I think, like it or not, architects think designing churches is important somehow. Somehow it's marvelous to do so, and I agree it's marvelous to do so. For the vast majority of architects, the opportunity to design churches occurs maybe once in their life, and you go berserk. If you're living in an atmosphere of self-indulgent church design from the very beginning of your career, designing churches not only, I wouldn't say it becomes commonplace, that wouldn't be fair and it's not true, but nevertheless, you don't get all overexcited by it. But on the other hand, things can spill into the other architecture, because I have realized, and I think most of us realize this, most people in the design churches bring their secularity to the work, and we have brought the ecclesiastical or the sacred aspect of church design to, or try to, of course. Everything I say, I'm not making a strong claim. I'm only trying to tell you how I felt about it, and I think it's long enough away for me to be allowed that kind of introspection. Now, we started off by designing a certain type of church, and this church work infected, I was going to say, maybe it's not quite the right word, but certainly informed our non-church or non-sacred work. And I think that's the interesting for me, and perhaps that's the interesting thing I want to talk about, that the ability or the opportunity to look at from first principle or from earlier principles, the design of churches, allowed us to examine architectural issues, which I must admit or I will claim were not at the forefront of the architectural thinking in 1950 onwards. But it was much concerned with all kinds of, well, I suppose the tail end of the modern movement. And now, in no way would I wish to be seen as denying the continuity for us of the modern movement, but the modern movement was something to be developed, not to be treated as a completed thing. And a lot of the activities in our architectural work, which incidentally did not always receive the approval or even the agreement of others. I remember, I think it was, maybe Monica is in the audience, maybe it wasn't her, but Monica and Theo Crosby came up to our office just after we had finished Glenrothley's church, which had a very harmless little pitched roof on it. And Theo said to me, we'd like to publish some of your work, but we never publish work with pitched roofs. Now this was around about middle of 50s. Now you can see how revolutionary we are. We actually put a little pitched roof on it. Another person I remember meeting when I was a young student, maybe I was never a young student, when I was a student, who said to me, you wouldn't put holes in walls, would you? It was actually not the damn thing. You could not put a hole in a wall. Just not allowed. It's forbidden. Now, we put holes in walls, and we were very concerned about how you might put a hole in a wall. But this whole wall, making holes in walls, seemed to be, at least at one level, the very essence of architecture. And of course, once you start making holes in walls, and once you start thinking about windows, not merely as filling a gap in a wall or between steel or concrete, but having its own necessary life, necessary synthetic existence outside the building, as well as practical purpose inside the building, and you try to integrate the inside and the outside, all kinds of things can happen, some of which, of course, are not necessarily obeying the full dogma of whatever it is, practicality, even functionalism. I don't know. I don't want to get into that. It's just once you look at these things, you realize a flat roof isn't an inevitable element of architecture, or a continuous ribbon window isn't an inevitable element. Once you realize that a reinforced concrete, a steel frame, can have a much deeper existence within the building rather than being a sort of, can I use an imperial measure, sort of 15 by 20 grid that rides all over the building and goes everywhere. Once you recognize these things, there are all kinds of marvelous things, or not marvelous, all kinds of freedom you can operate in. May not be marvelous. None of what I'm saying is intended to raise the appreciation of the work, but maybe the understanding of it. Maybe hopefully a little bit more understanding of architecture. Well, first thing we were deeply interested were the deep plan forms of buildings, for instance. At that time, buildings were very, very shallow, usually a corridor and room alongside, and they stretched as far as they needed to go till you ran out of site or program or worst of all, money. So that's still happening now, so perhaps one. Then we were very interested in the sectional articulation, that each floor level might be different from the previous floor when you put floors on top of each other, and I will discuss these with slides. As I already mentioned, we were interested in expressive fenestration as opposed to quantitative light functionalism, was to do with quality of light rather than quantity of light. And we also, because we came very late to large-scale jobs, at least jobs that had a significant extent over a site, and the opportunities presented themselves for the first time, we were very interested in developing an architecture which made some kind of contribution, both to its own urbanity, if that can be recognized, and to the urban context, where there might not have been any urban context. I mean, that's a rather complicated concept, and I will do my best not to talk about it later. But fact remains that the idea of using these perimeters of sites and the possibility of the building having a kind of making its own urbanity, that's the right word to use, at a very low scale perhaps, a very low size of development. But we were very lucky to have some of these opportunities. And the few buildings we put into the urban, the actual urban context are interesting in some ways. In some cases they've been de-urbanized, oddly enough, or decontextualized, and I will talk about that in a minute. But now I will show some slides. I don't know if that's good or bad, but you'll have to watch them anyway. Now this is a church at Glenrothes. This is the first, I think, deliberate, even self-conscious effort to re-examine the small church. Now, most of these churches we've built are done or erected either in the new towns of Scotland, and we had the opportunity to do 3 of the 4 new town churches in Scotland. And this is at Glenrothes, which is a very small building, but it does in fact incorporate a great number of features which we wanted to develop. First of all, it was a load-bearing construction. That was a load-bearing brick construction, which we thought was eminently suitable, both on the basis of historical precedent or maybe vernacular precedent, a little parish church built of white painted walls. So the whole thing was it was borne on load-bearing walls of a suitable thickness. Now, at a later stage, these walls will be pierced, but this wall wasn't pierced. It simply had a flat roof extending on 2 beams, which spanned from the tower element onto the front piers, and then a series of lightweight plywood-type troughs, plywood trough construction with inevitable felt roof, which we always thought would be the end of us, and probably was. And then we started using copper roofs in a very nice and traditional manner, and they were the end of us for sure. So you can never be right. You can never be right. You can get it wrong every time. Anyway, the whole point was that it was the walls were unpierced, but the front wall, or the front enclosure, I would say, was a glaze screen, which you can see in this thing, and a high-level glaze screen, which filled the space between the tall piers and formed the light source for the church. In other words, the light came, lit up the sanctuary, and was reflected into the congregational area. And the shape of the building, of course, has to do with, which I'm not going to go into in extent, but because I'm trying to stick to these themes, had to do with the fact that the altar side, the sanctuary of the building, has to be a certain size no matter how many people you accommodate. And you might even say that there's a sort of flappy hinge, and you make the building go that way, and you get the same number, double number of people with the same amount of altar space. But that was the important thing. The offending little pitched roof was this little beast here. Now that caused a whole lot of problems because it was slated. Now it was intended to be a little landmark because this building was put up in a new town in a total prairie atmosphere. And this is just to show you what we were on about here. The light coming from the high-level tower was split up or shadowed by the high-level screen on the altar. And this was a little altar cross we specially commissioned. A lot of our work involved in churches particular, but also secular work, commissioning artists to do their thing. But the recognition of what was going on outside was possible via the traversing shadow of this timber work. Could we have the next slide, please? And this is what this looked like from a middle distance, but you can see how it's in a prairie area. And this is what it looked like back when the painter was still painting. I think this is a nice picture. And a little bit still unpainted. The tower, which was the source of light for the church, was also the signal that a church was under construction. But it existed, I should say, then under construction. Point, of course, also is that the way the section was organized, that as you got nearer and nearer the building, elements of the building disappear. Occultation, I think they call it nowadays. Anyway, as you got nearer, so the whole business of being somewhere in relationship to a building was deliberately exploited. And as you got very close to the building, you didn't see the tower at all and so on. And different things came into view, and I will talk about that later. But the important thing is that the windows themselves, or the glazed areas, I should say, were the only, call it decorative elements, only the expressive areas of the building. Can we have the next slide, please? And this is what this looked like inside. It was a box with light coming on top of the altar and reflected into the thing, and this is what the shadowing of the screen, and it's traversing during the day. Even in Scotland we have the odd bits of sun, and of course the silhouetting of the altar, the silhouetting of the priest. And these were the good old days when the priest had his back to the congregation, and it produced quite a strong, powerful, and ecclesiastical effect. A lot of our clients said, well, maybe it doesn't look like a church, but it feels like a church. Now, that was real manna from heaven. The next slide, please. And this was a model, an alternative model for a big local church. This is the church at East Kilbride, again, Scotland's first new town, actually. And here, the client actually more or less ordered us, the Archbishop, to build a church which wasn't in scale to the parish, but it was in scale with the church's ambition for their presence in a new town in Scotland. So this time it's a box. Again, the box is this time tall. It is a load-bearing construction with diaphragm walls and various devices to stop the walls falling down. And we all know from our days as structural mechanics, the wall is more stable when it's actually carrying something. And so there were industrial-type trusses and industrial-type roofing was spanned from the long way. And I won't go into that now, why that would be, but it was spanning the long way, and the walls were made thick, in this case again, basically unpierced, in order to have strong differentiation between the external non-sacred world, the secular world, and to have a place of some kind of sacramental quality inside the building. And you can imagine that in a new town outside Glasgow, the place outside was pretty secular. So the strong transition from one to the other was seen as a valuable thing. But the other elements of this church, again, is the way the recognition that the building of this size needs considerable scale treatment. And the opening for the church, which is the entrance to the building, was via a folding back of the wall, which was in scale with the wall as a whole, or attempted to be in scale with the wall as a whole. It's absolutely not de rigueur to agree with what I'm saying. It's just to listen to it. Whether you think that slit is scaled with the wall or not is for you to make up your own minds about. But also, of course, because we don't believe or never believe that you should do any one thing for one reason, the wall also, by being folded, helps to strengthen the stability of the system. So you have the entry, which is marked at a long distance by the folding of the wall and the whole presence of the wall and its various manifestations, like these slits, or they're not really slits, but the thing is to do with the presence of the truss and the deliberate suppression or low statement of a low house for the priest and his household, contrasting with the tallness and the presence of the somewhat enigmatic, but I think a believable system as a church. And that's, next slide, please. But no, perhaps we should just go back. Forgive me, I brushed ahead a bit too much. But in order to make these walls do something more, as I said, and stand up, the flues, the diaphragm flue type wall in this case, was pierced with internal openings and roof lighting, which allowed them to act as concealed self-lighting, whatever, places for possible statues, etc. But of course, giving the wall as a whole a liveliness. And if you look closely, or perhaps I can show you that, I have to a little bit restricted the slides. All the four walls have a very different character. Next slide, please. And this is the appearance of the something wrong in the state of Denmark here. There's a slide or two missing, but it'll turn up, no doubt. That is a large wall. These are the house which is deliberately planned or designed to be as contrasty as a church as a whole. Some roof lighting which directs light deliberately at the altar end of the building. And this is where we started, shall we say, playing around with a number of things, like this sort of roof lighting, which is both dramatic in its function, or its form, but also specific in its function, and then a way of splitting up windows and with various transom effects and whatnot. This is simply a view of the building from the street, from the road. Next slide, please. This shows you how the wall is made, and how the interior, but the wall is made with a very substantial thickness, and that allows you both to manipulate the wall, but also in this case, cutting away the wall at that point in order to provide a smooth transition for the entry position, the entry point where the sharp corner is abraded, and then by means of a little bit of architectural or building manipulation, sort of things. Bricklayers in those days learned at trade school how to make such a thing, and they were very gratified that they could have a chance to do that in a real building. In 1956, that was really quite something. And then, of course, the other thing which may be of interest, because people don't talk about brick walls anymore, because everything is stretcher courses, if anything at all, it's simple. These walls were very thick, and for stability, but also they give us an opportunity to examine alternative bricklaying. Now, if you look closely at this, and I won't give you enough time to call me a liar, but the building, the bricklayers were instructed to, they may put 5 headers or 5 stretchers in succession of any mixture, permutate any of these, but never more than 5. This produced a highly randomized, but I think a highly expressive brick surface. And this is the interior of the wall of the building, with the diaphragm wall showing the opportunities for the thickness of the wall to allow light to penetrate to various levels. And the idea was, again, of course, to enliven the wall. That was the real reason. But there was also a good reason. The opportunity to file away rather less than exciting statuary, which was then commonplace in the Roman Catholic Church, was being provided. Next slide, please. This is a rooflet, incidentally. Of course, the photograph does... never mind. There's something... the main view... Never mind. Maybe it'll turn up somewhere. Anyway, this was a church of a similar nature, built good size, but built into a narrow town site, where similar principles were operated, except in this case, there was a necessary change of level. But again, the same principle of a thick wall, pierced and expressive, 2 different types or many different types of wall. In this case, there was an expressive roof. The roof was shown, and there was a very complicated wall modeling. Next slide, please. This one needs sharpening up, I think. And this is what this wall produced as a very elaborate modeling of light and brickwork. This is what this is made to look like outside. Next slide, please. Then there was this, sorry, this belongs to the previous one. There's been some muddle here. There always is a muddle. It's to test whether you're awake or not. This, of course, is the previous church, the Kilsyth church, showing the modeling of that wall. Photographs, of course, are not able to give the full quality of light, because something is either overexposed or underexposed, as we all know when you're photographing interiors. So the contrast is a little on the heavy side. And then there were a series of churches which were based on more or less a sort of square plan, centralized about the altar, and in which, again, a number of load-bearing systems are used. Now, I'm emphasizing the load-bearing nature of these systems because there's no structural frame, and certainly no repetitive structural frame to inhibit or to limit or in any way predetermine the shape of the building or any subdivision within the building which was not under control of the architectural intention. Now, I think that is very important, and we'll come back to that in due course. Next slide, please. This is a section of that building. So things have got a little bit of the section of this building is that this sloping laminated girder, or the bent sloping laminated girder, the roof light in this case fell over the middle of the church, more or less, and this thing was on a diagonal, and I was saying by missing this, by certain problem with the slides here, it's difficult to read that, but this was on a diagonal and not on a rectilinear system. This is incidentally when we turned to copper roofs, which have let us down, and this building has actually been demolished. Now, there's another version, a slightly earlier version, of the same kind of thing with the church. In this case, it has a little side chapel for day use and usual bits and pieces. But again, built on the principle of load-bearing construction with a large laminated roof, a large timber girder, which formed a window to the building. And these are a series of developments which were founded on previous experiences. And most of these were built in facing brick, inside and out, the same brick. Next slide, please. This is what this looked like when it wasn't quite finished. That's what the other one looked like when it wasn't quite completed. Next slide, please. And then we had the opportunity to build a church in the middle of Glasgow. It's not right in the middle, but in the urban area of Glasgow. Indeed, in a industrial, some light industrial area, where the next door neighbor, I think, was a tobacco factory, which is now empty as a tobacco making operation. This is still in use as a church, fortunately. And it is, sorry, I should dispose of this. This belongs to the previous. It shows you the high level light, the laminated timber roofs, and the centralized altar, and the plain interiors, the basically windowless interior. So could we go on to the next slide on my right? On the right on the screen, I should say. Yes, that's better. We're moving back in some kind of. This church owes its shape entirely to the form of the site, basically. And this is the street, and this is a little bit of back garden belonging to a house. The site slopes significantly, and once again, it uses a folded section to provide a high-level window, in this case on the side, for reasons which I won't go into. It has also, curiously, got some column system. Now, we don't have anything against columns, I rather like them, but the columns are not allowed to be dictated by the structural engineer's decision what size the column should be, and indeed these columns have been beefed up to look appropriate for the space it occupies. Now, there was another blasphemous thing to do in those days. I'm not sure it isn't still blasphemous. Maybe I hear a sharp intake of breath. But we've deliberately beefed up these columns. They actually are steel columns with concrete encasing to make them look appropriate to the dimension of the building and not to the engineering handbook. Anyway, it has a high-level window in this case, which is fretted, covered with fretted timber, I think stolen straight from the traditional British railway system, and a very complicated modeled brick interior. And you come up, because of the change of level, you come up steps. You have the sacristy is in this position, and the church itself expands outwards to the altar, again for the same argument. It's got side altars, all the bits and pieces which were then required, although they're no longer part of the liturgy, and a lot of these churches have had significant changes made to them. Next slide, please. And that's what it looks like outside. This is the street side. The roof sweeps down very low at the front of the building. And this is what it's like inside. This is fretted timber, some high-level windows which you don't actually really see in most positions. An elaborately sculpted brick wall, and again, a great deal of emphasis on, well, obviously light and form, but also on the appropriateness and the position of brick, of concrete or columns, and the articulation of these columns quite outwith the structural truth as perceived by some people. In other words, there is in fact a steel truss in there, but it's decently concealed, and it's given a bit of sex appeal, I think, by a little bit of manipulation. But it's also intended to create a structural presence, which doesn't derive, I think, entirely from arithmetic or mathematics. Next slide, please. These are again, I'm sorry, these slides are out of phase. I won't tell you why. It's a good reason, but you can blame me anyway. This is as you come into the church, you come up to steps to what was then the baptistry. You turn at right angles and you face the church. Could we have this one out and the other one in? The next one. Yeah, no, I wanted this one. The plan has to come back. The one on the right must be returned. Now, this is the first of the secular buildings I want to show you. It's was designed originally for handicapped, mentally and physically handicapped children. In the event, it was simply used for, I think, physically handicapped children. It really consists of two small schools linked by a kitchen, some staff accommodation, and a hall. And the point about this is a number of things. One is our interest in very deep buildings. Even though this was a single-story building, it was exceptionally deep. It had a double corridor arrangement. Again, most of it, the outside skin or the outside layer, was done in load-bearing construction with a relatively thick pierced wall on the outside, with some timber construction where the columns and the mullions were integrated into the hall design and the two tall spaces. And the whole thing, as I said, again, there's no obvious or self-evident or what I would prefer to describe autonomous frame to the building. The whole thing was based on the free use of brick load-bearing construction, but certainly the liberated use of load-bearing construction. But what most of all mattered to us at that time was the opportunity to differentiate the tall building, which was essentially a timber high-level glazed box, with the deliberate and presence of pierced brick walls, which I think had some depth, and had for their main lighting, which is the beginning of a differentiation between light that was used, or windows that were used for lighting the building, as opposed to windows that were basically for looking out of the building. And this differentiation, as saying, was seen by us as a qualitative rather than a quantitative exercise. Next slide, please. This is what this looked like. Not so much unusual for us, but a deliberate effort to use color to make the building a little more playful. And this is the high-level clear-story windows, which are actually separated in the interior of the building by plywood box girders, and then the low-level windows, which are either concrete mullions or hole-in-the-wall windows. And there's a whole idea of composing the exterior of the building as well as composing the elements of the thing. Just to explain, this high-level canopy was needed in order to allow buses. The children were bused to the school to enter, to approach close to the entrance doors. Next slides, please. It's the right ones. Then this is These slides now deal with, on this particular building, and a succession of them deals with multi-story, multi-layered buildings which exploit, again, either they exploit, they specifically exploit or make use of a very highly controlled, custom-built, perhaps specialized reinforced concrete frame. In this case, it consists of a double cantilever construction with an inverted concrete floor, at least a concrete ceiling, which not only helps the construction of the stress management of the cantilevers, but allows the floors to be both to be timber, to be accessible duct. This was the first effort in this direction, to remove the concrete frame from its inhibiting effect on the exterior of the building. Now, this gave rise to a very specialized frame in this case. You can see the march of columns. And while the plan itself is fairly normal in the present-day circumstances and probably in historic circumstances, but at the time, if those of us who are old enough will remember, a one-sided, a single-loaded corridor was all the rage. So you had a corridor which tended to have the same fenestration, which was maybe 6 feet wide, compared to the room, which may have been 20 feet wide or something, having the same window basically on both sides. This was the first attempt to compress the building back into a minimal, or at least an optimum dimension. But the consequence of that used to be that the rooms, of course, on a single-sided formation had some considerable opportunity to get additional light from the center of the plan, or from the corridor of the plan. In order to overcome the difficulties created in a double-sided or double-stacked corridor, we introduced a series of light shelves which had the intention of, one, distributing the light more deeply into plan equitably, again in qualitative terms, not as in quantitative terms, and also made the scale of the room at that point more tolerable. The roof, of course, is then, or the ceiling is then used as a reflector, a more active reflector, and there's a definite shape to the room, shall we say. The two sides of the room, the corridor side and the window side, have a different operational and visual presence. And again, I'm saying this became quite an important consideration for us. A series of developments arising from that, where this was a very early beginning. But the idea of the reinforced concrete frame not being a sort of prefabricated operation which pre-existed the building, the frame being totally integrated into the building and ceasing to dominate the facade, although, of course, in this case, the grid still has considerable sway on the facade. Next slide, please. Well, this is the building I'm talking about. It's this one. You see it's been modeled and subdivided, and the facades are beginning to do their own thing. At least they're beginning to develop a totality, hopefully, which isn't just a byproduct of the internal arrangement. Next slide, please. There's another version of this, which is actually more intense. This is a city building, was a city building, and it remains in the city, but this is the one that's been decontextualized. Now, this is quite a small extension to a school, consisting of a series of large rooms, and this is another characteristic which we have endeavored to look at, is small volumes over large volumes, being integrated as opposed to being separated and connected in some way. And this is a series of halls and gymnasia, etc. And then above it, there are a series of classrooms, which are only entered by means of staircases. And a lot of this is, in fact, load-bearing construction, although there's a limited amount of concrete frames. You won't be too surprised that the span goes this way in this building, spans onto these intermediate walls, defining the staircase, and again utilizing for double-sided thing light shelves, and as I said, elaborating the facades to become compositions in their own right. In other words, here, for instance, the classroom, the staff room elements, which are given a totally different treatment. The building was an extension to a school. It has now become an office building, and miraculously, they've removed this partition. Now, because that's not a load-bearing partition, that could be removed. Whether that's a good thing or bad thing, I don't know. I'm quite happy about it. The people have done their job. We're very proud of what they had done or not done to the school. And they took me around, and I must say I was quite impressed with the quality of space as an open planned office this had developed into. I wouldn't make any claim that it was either intended or even realized. But again, it perhaps shows that if your reinforced concrete construction or your load-bearing construction is of a more specific type, you might be able to exploit that in a positive way later on. This building, I'm saying, is adjacent to Glasgow Green, Glasgow's oldest park, and it used to have a nice arched monument there. And in light of that arched monument, we introduced a little arched opening here at a very early stage of postmodernism. And Andy usually blames me for this. And I take the credit, because it's quite right, I did it. But I think it was so premature that he didn't want to be associated with it. Anyway, it has a nice little arch there. There's another series of features. Could you have the next slide, please? And this is what the context it used to be. A fairly sort of gritty mixture of survival of Georgian houses and light industrial units, a drill hall. And that's just simply a detail showing the elaboration of the facade and its compositional complexity. And then, of course, there's a roof there with a water tank to simulate chimneys and things. And there's that arched opening. The next slide, please. And then when it's been decontextualized, all the other buildings round about have been removed. So from being one of our few city infills, it's become a freestanding object. I think there's a lesson there somewhere. I'm not sure what the lesson is, but I'm sure there is a lesson. But you can see now how the compositional intentions, I think, have been retained, in spite of the lack of support, so to speak, from the other buildings. But curiously, they've also removed the arch across the way. And so now the arch itself is also marooned in this building, devoid of, what do they call it, contextual or what is the word? Gavin Stamp would know the word is, reference or something. But I think it's okay. I mean, I'm not complaining about it. I quite liked its contextual existence, but it's either our buildings removed or people remove their buildings from ours. I think it's a tragic situation, but I don't know whether to cry or to laugh. Next slide, please. Now, these slides are getting a bit difficult to see. This is a major technical college, a large building in Cumbernauld New Town, adjacent to the town centre, and with things I won't go into in any detail, but we were required, what was then called, I think Dudley Leaker, the architect of the new town, said we had to obey the discipline of the new town, which meant car parking under every building. This discipline lasted just till we finished this building, when Woolworths came in, and they wouldn't have car parking under the building. They wouldn't even think of it. So Woolworths got down back onto the ground. This building is raised on the first floor, as you will see, with a major access. Anyway, the nature of this building is a series of large rooms, a games hall, a dining hall, assembly hall, placed under the large number of relatively small cellular elements, again arranged on a double bank plan, and having a very modest, although actually quite deliberately nonsensical, reinforced concrete structure, which I will explain to you in a minute. And this allows the underneath of the building to live its own life. Next slides, please. And this is a sort of basic section where you have this large platform, pierced alternately, with the other accommodation, the small-scale accommodation, not randomly disposed, but freely disposed underneath, with no columns on the front or back, or anywhere else, if you may say, to interfere or inhibit the facade development, or shall we say the sectional development, which is recognized in the facade. One of the obsessions that we have then, and I think I have now, although there's not a lot to be exercised, is the idea that every floor is not only different, but self-revealing, that you know which floor you're on. I mean, the reaction to the standard post-war modernity was you could be in any floor, except maybe the bottom floor you would know where you are, On the top floor, you might know where you are, but in between is any floor whatsoever. It's actually a Glasgow experience. You wake up after the night before New Year, what name I've forgotten, and you wake up in a tenement flat, and people ask you, who are you? And they say, well, actually, I'm Jimmy so-and-so. Aren't you John Smith? You say, no, you're in the wrong flat. But you can't tell because every flat's exactly the same, because it's a gravity construction with no articulation from floor to floor. That gave us some idea that not only is this a rather patently boring way of making buildings, but it certainly doesn't create a responsive exterior or interior. And this is a drawing which shows the development of the structure, which I've included because these are the structures. The spans in this building are 60 feet. I was going to say 60 meters. But once you get to that kind of span, it doesn't actually matter whether it's feet in meters. So this is a 60-foot span, basically supported by these towers. You can see one of the development drawings, one of the few we've actually saved because we don't usually keep our development drawings. People have to enjoy or understand the building without having to be too explained to them. But you can see how this operates. It allows a detailed exploitation of the floor levels and the deeper rooms and the shallower rooms. These rooms have got bilateral lighting because they're on the roof. This particular building has the same kind of idea of a sort of sophisticated, or more elaborate, I should say, light shelf. There are light wells which light up the interior space, and the opportunity to give ceiling heights, space, and volumetric relationship together. This is the remainder of the first floor access, which was supposed to be all car parking. But we've taken the building back down to ground. Next slide, please. This just simply shows another one of the sections. There are many varied sections in this building. But this shows the construction of that roof, that shelf, which consists of the cantilevers, these cantilevers there, which hold up the cranked steel beam, which themselves sit on steel moldings. I'm only showing that to show that a certain freedom of use of materials was implicit in this. There was no coherent, complete reinforced concrete frame. There was an appropriate, what we thought appropriate mixture of constructions. Next slide, please. And this is what this looked like. Incidentally, it was supposed to be extended one day, so the two ends have a different quality. But the point is that this part of the building floats above the other bit, which is simply, again, load-bearing construction on the ground. This is the games hall and the various other large spaces. And again, because of this setback, not only do we have a fairly complex compositional possibility without the building going right down to ground in every case, but also the appearance, or shall we say the experience of the building as you approach the building, which these slides are trying to show, varies from the distance you are at the building, because this piece disappears as you come closer and closer. This piece becomes more and more in evidence, and so you see a piece of building adjacent to you, which is sitting not freely, but at least under the projected like canopy of the building above. Next slide, please. Just shows you how the building changes. This slowly disappears. That takes you back to the church of Glen Rothes and the various other churches. So this occultation. So when you're right close up to the building, what you're up against is not a building that's 4-story or 14 stories high, which hits the ground and you can look right up. But it is actually a building which divides itself into bottom, middle, and top. And as you get closer, it doesn't hopefully consist of seeing more and more of the screw heads of the aluminium cladding, or maybe more detail of the glazing detail, but a very different experience as you approach and go away from the building. Next slide, please. Then we come to a culmination, I suppose, of that kind of thinking, which involves the making of, making of a seminary, which consists of a whole series of cellular elements, repeated cellular elements for the student priests over the large-scale accommodation, the communal accommodation, which is encapsulated within the receding composition of rooms. Now, this, of course, these are called two cross sections, one at the dining hall and one at the chapel, and then a long section, which is this thing that Gordon was so keen to discuss, the wall, the ramp up, the sanctuary, the roof light over the sanctuary, and the two large spaces, which is the refectory or the dining area and the chapel. This is the site of it was an existing, very fine Bonnet the Elder mansion built by a shipping millionaire, and it's too complicated to explain the use of the site, but basically the site was developed in such a way that all the existing trees, and this man collected trees the way some people collect stamps. I'm talking about green stamps, not thing-based stamps, and all the existing stone hard landscaping was to be retained by us. I mean, this wasn't the client's requirement. I'm not sure what the client required, but we kept all the stone thing, and that dominates the thinking about the placing and the making of this building. This was a little convent, which is a kind of small model of the main building, dining rooms and sitting rooms for the nuns, a shared kitchen. The house itself was converted for priests, 10 priests, sitting rooms and dining rooms, etc. And this actually, I mean, when people accuse us, rightly I think, of having maybe seen too many Cobb volumes, this building is rightly and was quite self-consciously seen as a recycling of Cobbian details. I've never believed, because somebody's already used a detail. Imagine if you never used a screw or a bolt because somebody's used it before, or a wheel for that matter. We thought these ideas, some of the ideas of Cobb's were extremely reusable, and we actually did this quite deliberately. On the other hand, the making of this building, its formal quality, was not based on any traditional precept. It wasn't based on a Dominican monastery, well, simply because it wasn't a Dominican monastery. Although those of you who are well into your Cobb lore will know that La Tourette actually is in fact a seminary, in this case run by monks instead of priests, whatever good that'll do, and it was actually for the same number of people. And I have to admit, it wasn't until I went there, after this building was finished, believe it or not, that I realized there was an amazing congruence between that program and ours. But enough of the special pleading. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is well, that's a basement plan, which is the wrong way around, of course. One has to be the wrong way around. There's not much to say. I mean, there's a lot to be said, but we don't have time to say it. But basically, you come along this road, which leads to the service areas, and then onto the convent. You go underneath the building, over a boat sort of thing. You'll see that in a minute. A causeway made of old Glasgow granite sets, and you pass under the building. You go to the front door of the old house, where this is the entrance. There's a minor entrance to that little staircase, which is not intended for utilization except by people in the know, and certainly not by outsiders. There's a lower chapel for many repetitive number of altars. There's a library which is tucked in behind the existing stone wall. There's this little convent which angles slightly to give the nuns both privacy and a view of the beautiful landscape. And then this is the full collegiate hall for dining hall, and this is the collegiate chapel that's facing, and facing pews, very large sanctuary end. This is a ramp which for formal occasions. This, of course, is utilized for ordination of student priests who have to prostrate themselves or did prostrate themselves on this floor, and this can be used for a large number of priests. A whole lot of bits and pieces here which there isn't neither time nor particularly relevant to this discussion. But the important point I want to make out is for the coding of this drawing is of some interest. All the red stuff is load bearing. So this large massive wall, again carved both for internal organization and for structural reasons, and of course corresponding for external effect, is load bearing. Everything that's green is reinforced concrete. But once again, the reinforced concrete frame is bespoke, built into the system, and not can't exist out with, or nor can a building exist without it. Again, the facades are freed from the dominance of the frame, but the columns that come down from the upper level are utilized to organize both the two spaces, but also act as sort of light shades, or view shades rather, to prevent excessive intrusion of the view on this level to be operative. Next slide, please. And this system continues upwards, as you have seen from the section, gets closer and closer together. And these, of course, are voids over the two major spaces, which are lit, significantly lit from gable lights. So each window, each bit of the building has its own light, and this is the roof light. Next slide, please. Just as I thought there might be some students here. This is how this building is made. It's made with cross walls at cell centers, carried on reinforced concrete columns, elongated reinforced concrete columns. And of course, the building isn't stable till the connection is made at the top level, and that's why probably they can't knock it down. It's built in. And this is simply the top floor where the two sides come together. This was to be a place for playing snooker and billiards, table tennis, God knows what. This was built originally for 106 students, never had more than 50 students, and now, of course, it's got no students at all. And it's lying in a state of extreme dereliction. But again, the use of the frame, the use of the integration of frame to plan is what I'm discussing. The way the freedom of certainly the ground floor is once again achieved by the very extreme discipline of the reinforced concrete frame. Next slide, please. This is what this looked like in its heyday. Again, it shows this moat, shows the walk, the cross thing there, shows the cloister at the lowest level, shows the refectory and chapel elevation of fenestration, and it shows the way that the top level of the building recedes as you come closer and closer to it. And again, this is a back view which shows the port of the existing building. You walk through the cloister up to the existing building, and this forms an enclosure. But again, there's a series of compositional devices. Each room has an arched element. It has a light shelf, and it has a balcony of its own, which also acts as fire escapes. This was a little well we found behind that retaining wall. We added the necessary water spout with a chain, and that allegedly kept the water in the moat. Next slide, please. And this is what this looked like in the dining, in the hall, with the large, massive window, compositional window for the size of space, the overhang of the cantilevered rooms and corridors, and the arrangement of the lighting and structure to define and to participate, what I would consider actively in that space, as opposed to passively, as being merely a byproduct of what goes on inside. The same section is utilized in the chapel, difference being that the timber balcony fronts or gallery fronts, in the case of the refectory, are extended to the soffit of the structural beams, and therefore to give both additional privacy to the chapel, but a different form. Here you can see the roof light, which is a stepped roof light, which lights the carved wall, which turned Gordon on. It was actually quite an impressive experience, or was, to see the priests silhouetted against this wall. And of course, those of you who are still awake may realize this is a very similar kind of light and space manipulation as I showed you in the very first building. That is a chapel at the church at Glenrothes. Next slide, please. That's a view of the hall, although they later, because they must have felt lonely, started shifting the tables around. But then, of course, another view of the chapel. Next slide, please. This, of course, I can't mention every time, but this again is not this one, the previous building, is a case where the large volumes are organized under the small volumes and not separated out from them. This is an extension to Wadham College, which we did a master plan, which begins to both address issues of ceremonial and formality in relationship to existing buildings, and the external relationship of these buildings to the rest of the city, in this case, Oxford. This is the previously existing building, the old foundation, a series of new buildings, or relatively new, if you consider a building built in the 18th century as new, and then some post-war intervention, not by us, then a master plan which formed a perimeter development with a head, the head being a new library. And that building, we actually built this piece of it. We then lost the commission to somebody else. I don't think he's shown up here tonight, but he's very welcome, incidentally. And this is simply a very compressed plan or series of plans of the building. The important thing about it here again is the way different types of accommodation lie on top of each other or interact or nestle into each other. This is an L-shaped, three-floored library element, which is basically carried on towers, reinforced concrete towers, which form the study carrels of the building. And again, there's no systematic reinforced concrete frame. There's the odd reinforced concrete columns, which are more or less either decently concealed within the book stacks or made a great production out of. And lying on top of it, there's actually a totally alien object, which is an upper court where certainly the dons, the fellows of the college, can revel, enjoy their private existence. This was supposed to have a series of units added to it, staircase accessed elements for the residential needs of the college. But nestling within that L shape, there's a sort of cube of differently divided space, which forms a special library and reading rooms. It's actually spatially a very complex composition. But the point I'm mainly making is the way different spaces coexist within the same envelope. Next slide, please. This shows you the typical, well, not a typical, there is no typical section. You'll have noticed by now these buildings seem to have they grow sections the way octopus grows legs or something. But this is a diagonal staircase, the shelves for the three-level reading room, the inserted cube or the nestling cube, which is divided into two areas for the relationship to the size, and the upper court, which sits on a very heavy, actually mostly empty roof over the top of this, and is built of, again, load-bearing construction. There's nothing too dogmatic about the making of this building, but it shows more clearly the structural emphasis on elements of use rather than of autonomous reinforced concrete or steel framing. The idea of this building, of course, was that the books and the shelving constitutes the real decoration. And we made a special effort not to bring the concrete and the books into close proximity. Next slide, please. And as we have this again, we have the massive lead roof, which represents the residential accommodation. You have the towers and the beams spanning between the towers, forming the structural support for the floors, and the massing of windows in this case. And again, a complex articulation of different kinds of windows representing different kinds of space. This is a lot of this is in precast model concrete, and this is lead, of course. Next slide, please. This simply shows the material composition of this ordering of the thing. One of the views inside the library looking over into the reading spaces, the larger reading spaces. Next slide, please. Now we come to a different strain, although touched on in a previous thing, and I show you this hasn't gone too much longer. This is a little backyard, land development for some old person's houses, and I won't show you a lot of this, but where we use the houses themselves to form a wall of sorts, cutting off the back gardens of the other, basically freestanding or semi-detached houses, sitting in the middle of which is a old person's home, which in a way reprises the modulation or the modeling of the thing as a whole. Again, as I said, boringly, these are basically load-bearing constructions in concrete, brick, and timber, and that's reverting back to the hole-in-the-wall exercises, which belong to this facade here, this facade here, and the high-level roof lighting, which concentrates the other wind of the fenestration in a deliberate contrast. Next slide, please. And then we come to a much more complex ordering of the same thing, and as I was saying, is where a sort of integral or intrinsic attempt at urbanization of a non-urban site is being investigated. This is some students resident outside Hull for Hull University on a greenfield site, except for the existence of a rather ordinary, I would say so, in spite of Gavin Stamp's presence of very ordinary Neo-Georgian, post-war Neo-Georgianism. And we were asked to make a development plan, and the development plan consists of 12 units, which had certain requirements. One is it should be built not all at once, in series of stages, but at any one time we decided it should look complete. No reinforcing rods sticking out. And two is that there should be a manipulation of space on a large scale and local manipulation belonging to each unit. Now this, again, boringly, this is a load-bearing construction. This shows you one of these pieces. This shows you the assembly of staircase access elements, which are shown in this. Subtly, some of the stairs go through, some of the staircases keep alternate level, allowing us to manipulate both the roof line and the floor, the ground line in relationship to the existing site, and allowing us to keep existing trees, going around existing trees wherever possible. We're very concerned, actually, while we don't talk about it to a great extent, of the pre-existent landscaping in developments. And this is simply a room. The room is aggregated into a series of staircase elements themselves are aggregated. And by slipping them, not only do you produce these local events pertaining to each hall, you also allow natural ventilation and lighting to the kitchens and bathrooms, which are on the gables, so to speak. But also it provides this, and this is probably the most important thing, provides this a continuous wall, which itself is stepped and manipulated, which, and again, because of the geometry, which serves both the internal arrangement and the external arrangement, gives you a series of spatial, I think appropriate spatial experiences, depending whether you can see the thing from inside the scheme or from outside the scheme. This was a center block which built. In the event, because it was designed to be built in stages, we built this one first as a prototype, which was slightly modified. We then built 2 of these, I think it was, and then 3 of these. And because it could be built in stages, it could also not be finished in stages. And it was now the 6 units were never built. But this gives you some kind of idea of the composition of this thing. The pieces that closed the ends were ad hoc in the sense of different types of accommodation were provided for a different combination of wardens and sub-wardens. And there was at the peak of this building also a common room, and then each staircase had its kind of staircase life, because the extended stair formed a kind of sitting area for the students at that level. Again, you won't be too surprised. I hope that this is all built on load-bearing construction, load-bearing walls with concrete floors, timber roofs. Next slide, please. This is what this looks like. This is a large internal space, which originally was supposed to have a lake there, water balancing lake, because all 12 weren't built. They didn't need to balance the water, although this is in Yorkshire. I'm sure they're sorry now. This is a kind of discontinuous continuity we were aiming for. This is one of the trees that we managed to build into the system. So you do get up variation in skyline, you have variation in levels, and continuity with identifiable elements. Next slide, please. There's a great deal of playing around with brick, as you can imagine, with soldier courses and stretcher courses and God knows what else. This shows how this breaks up into a series of pavilions, because the geometry had two different geometry, the geometry of the exterior and the geometry of the room where they meet on balconies, then the geometry of the staircase coming to the landing, the extended landing coming to the outside. So a series of blocks of random 2, 3, or 5 units. And this is what this experience of walking towards it with kitchens and bathroom windows in this position. Next slide, please. That's again showing just simply the fairly elaborate brickwork, which a proper brick wall allows you to produce. It shows you the copper-faced landing, stair extension, landing window, the difference between the landing window and the room window. Next slide, please. And then we come, I promise you, to the last project. But this is probably the most, well, it was the last, here in the lecture, the last project of any importance that the firm were allowed to do. I think at some stage our people, our potential clients thought we'd had enough practice, didn't need any more. And this was the big one, which that we sank the office. Anyway, it was a competition for a new college at Cambridge in a very nice, beautiful site. Now, for once, the trees that are drawn in this site don't belong to the imagination of the draftsman. This is actually a fairly accurate representation of the existing site, which had a hedge of trees on 3 sides, or 4 sides, really, had a water course, which forms part of the drainage system of West Cambridge, and had a series of existing houses on it, which is too complicated to explain. But this is the actual one of the 4 original competition drawings. The important thing here again is the perimeter development of the site. These occupy actually the back gardens or the gardens of the pre-existing houses, allowing us to leave unblemished, untouched, the existing tree structure. So the existing tree structure was, as far as possible, retained. And of course, the advantage of that is, unlike, say, beautiful colleges like King's College or Trinity, who started off bald, off with a college which had both trees and building simultaneously. Most people, of course, think that the trees in Oxbridge colleges have always been there, and that the architects have been very clever at building around them. But our trees have always been there, and possibly we were quite clever building around them. But that's for you to judge. Anyway, the intention of this building was utilize the perimeter of the site for the necessarily extensive frontages required in a college, and also to be a kind of a topological version of a traditional college. Now, these are a series of courtyards, each having their own shape and function. And an event like the previous job, we only built this piece,